Hello there, listeners. It's Susie New from the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, and thank you for listening to our podcast. It's called Australian Anaesthesia, and it's where we talk about all things relevant to anaesthesia in Australia. In this episode, I'm chatting with someone who's not an Australian, who's from the UK. It's Professor Tim Cook, who I hope you have all heard about, as he is the person behind the NAPs, the huge national audit projects from the UK. Professor Cook was also very much on my radar due to the work he did and some of his advocacy during the COVID pandemic. He, like us in the ASA, was a very strong voice for respiratory protection for healthcare workers, as well as a whole raft of measures that we contemplated, which was 5 years ago. So I was thrilled to meet him in person and record this podcast face-to-face at the ASA's National Scientific Congress in Canberra recently. At the start of the podcast, I've included some of our chit-chat about titles and how we introduce ourselves. For those of you who listen regularly to the podcast, you know I've been talking about that in the last 4 or 5 episodes, and I think this follows on really nicely from some of the things that I've been discussing in terms of how we introduce ourselves. I've been focusing on the vocal aspects of that, but we talk about the non-verbal or the visual aspects, and our discussion gave me a little merchandise idea, which I'll share with you at the end of the episode. Professor Cook and I, in this episode, we chat about what success means to him, the challenges involved with putting the national audit projects together, and I couldn't help asking him a COVID-related question. Enough from me, let's get into it. Thank you. Thanks for joining us in the podcast booth at the NSC today.
Pleasure.
You've just arrived, so I understand what it feels like to just get off that very long flight from the UK. So hopefully, I'm not going to ask you anything too challenging.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm vulnerable at the moment, so I'm a bit upside down. But
Awesome.
Yeah.
Can I call you Tim?
Yeah.
Because when I do these with people from the UK, everyone's Professor this and Doctor this.
I'm a firm believer that people should use their titles with patients.
Yes.
Mainly so patients know who they're speaking to. But I think once you've introduced yourself, I think what you then do is fine, but also with peers. Why wouldn't you have a normal conversation?
Do you introduce yourself as Professor Cook, or would you say Doctor?
I introduce myself as Professor Tim Cook.
Yeah.
In fact, my shoes say Professor Tim Cook. My theatre cap says Professor Tim Cook. When I'm on ITU, it says Consultant Intensivist, and mine, I've personally had it embroidered. Not because I think showboating, I think the patients need to know who they're dealing with. Particularly in the UK, we have quite a problem with doctor substitution. So we've had issues
Physician
with
associates.
Individuals. I've actually written an article in the BMJ about it. I think it's particularly important. Anaesthetists are often not recognised as doctors, particularly females. So young female anaesthetists, they need to explain who they are, otherwise they get misidentified.
All right. So I know you most for all that amazing work you've done with the NAP projects. To you, what do you think has been your biggest success in your career?
I was kind of forewarned that you were going to ask that question, and so I'm getting on a bit now. One of the things I'm proudest of is kind of putting in a decent shift. I first started working in the NHS in 1987, so I'm getting 37 years, will be 40 before I retire.
You do not look old enough.
So I think you're actually working in the NHS for 40 years. I've always been a full-time consultant. I've never had an academic post. Doing that for 37 years, I'm quite proud of that. I'm proud of the trainees that have come through the trust, some of whom I hope have been inspired to go on to good clinical careers, but also some have got engaged in research while they've been in Bath. Not necessarily under my tutelage, but we've got a few people in Bath, people like Jerry Nolan as well, who direct people like that. And then, understandably, the NAPs have been a central part of my career for about 20 years. And I'm very lucky because they are genuinely a national collaborative. And I'm the person that gets put up as sort of the figurehead of them because I've been involved in quite a few of them. So I am proud of what we as an anaesthetic community have achieved. And I'm proud to have been in a position to lead those or direct those and to influence what we've produced.
Yeah, they're a fantastic undertaking. And as you said, it's a national project. And leading a project on such a big scale must have come with some challenges.
So they're academic outputs, but they're what we would call service evaluations. They're national audits, but they're not audits. They're some of the most successful research papers that have been produced in anaesthesia in the last 2 decades. But I've been in the fortunate position that they're largely organised by the college, and therefore there's an infrastructure behind the projects which has enabled me to do those. But balancing a full-time clinical job with leading and directing those projects has been a challenge. I think anybody who takes on additional roles accepts there is some sacrifice by themselves and by the people at home who support them, by the family. The biggest challenge with the first NAP was getting national engagement. So it took me, I was clinical lead, but I was a very junior clinical lead, effectively, because it was a new endeavour. For NAP3, which studied central neuraxial blockade, I had to get all hospitals to engage, or as many as we could. And the first 70% was easy. You sent out an email, they came back and said, yes, we'll do it. And the next 30% was increasingly difficult. And essentially, I ended up ringing the hospitals, and you can imagine getting through switchboards to get to the right person, etc., to get them engaged. It took a huge amount of effort. And I remember there was one particular person who was about the third last person I had to get, third last hospital, and he said I chased him more than the Inland Revenue did. So it was a challenge to get engagement with that one, but subsequently people not just fell into line, but people engaged, they understood the projects had merit, they got something back from them, and since then there's kind of been a miraculous occurrence in that you have this faith, you put the projects out and people just come back, because all the work for the NAPs is done on the front line by the clinicians, really.
You know, they talk about once you get momentum, you build it, it keeps building by itself. But they also talk about when you're first starting something that you might start with a small step and build it up incrementally. So did you take those small steps, or did you just go straight into a national audit?
So the project originally that the college had, this was about 2009, maybe 2005 actually, the college had £50,000 sitting around. They didn't really know what to do with it. They said we need to do a project. And at that time there was a guideline which was not very evidence-based, a guideline which had something like 123 recommendations for how to run epidurals on the ward when we were doing a lot more perioperative epidurals. And the original plan was that we were going to audit that. So we were just going to do an audit of compliance with 123 recommendations. And we convened a group of all the stakeholders who were going to come in and do it. And we were literally outside that meeting. And then Tony Wildsmith, who was the director of football, if I was the football manager for the project, pulled me to one side and said, we've changed our plan, we're going to do something different. And then on the back of an envelope explained what he thought we'd do. So with the wrong group of people in the room, we then went in and said we're going to do this and that. And we then had the structure of the first NAP as we now know it, which was an activity survey and a registry, and then the process has evolved since then. But we did go from zero to national full steam ahead pretty much straight away. So no, we didn't start small.
Wow, that is a huge undertaking. So well done getting that off the ground. And with that shift as well, it sounds like there were quite a few relationships and people to get on board and all of that.
But I think anaesthetists are really good. You know, when you're trying to find a career, you try and find a crowd that suits you, you try and find your sort of tribe. Anaesthetists are really, I think we're passionate about what we do. We don't cause many complications, but we care about the complications we cause. We clear up other people's complications. And I think we do have a very patient-centred approach. We're also often a bit geeky. And so the NAPs kind of work because anaesthetists want to know about rare events. They're invested in it. And the topics are chosen specifically to be important to patients, important to anaesthetists, not easily studied by other mechanisms, and not previously studied in full. And the bit about important to anaesthetists is key, because if it wasn't important to anaesthetists, then the work wouldn't get done. We wouldn't get the information back that we rely on. And really the performance by anaesthetists in the UK in terms of giving the information which has created the data that the NAPs produce has been remarkable. And it is worth saying that 20 years ago when we started, there wasn't a lot of this citizen science, particularly in anaesthesia. It was a bit of a wilderness in terms of anaesthesia research, but now we have the NAPs, the SNAPs. We have pretty much every month we have these service evaluations looking at what we do, and probably a big increase in the overall amount of research that we do. So I think the NAPs have partly been about that, making anaesthetists understand that they can do pretty simple research on a small level for them, but when you put it together in big piles, it creates something of value.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I'm often asked to comment or thinking about the approach that anaesthetists have towards safety. And whether you think it differs from other medical professionals in terms of our risk appetite, what we're prepared to tolerate. This, I think, really came out during the pandemic in terms of respiratory protection, that other specialties were perhaps a bit more cavalier compared to anaesthetists.
Going back to your first question, that's another area that I'm proud of. I did quite a lot of work in the pandemic early on, looking at healthcare safety in the pandemic. I'm pretty proud of what I did with other people in that at that time, and some of the science of aerosol risk at that time. Anaesthetist attitude to risk. Well, classically, there's a dichotomy, isn't there? There's the kind of cowboy anaesthetist who doesn't see risk and gets on with everything. And then there's the more meticulous, slightly more cautious anaesthetist. But as a specialty, I think we've moved away from the cowboys and towards, perhaps sometimes too much, towards the more cautious approach. I think, in my view, anaesthetists remain, get up and do things. I guess the big change is that we've always understood risk. We've always accepted there is some risk. Certainly in the UK, the big transformation has been that we have to communicate that risk to patients, because as patient representatives have said to me on projects, you always need to remember in these projects, it's the patient that takes the risk, not the anaesthetist.
That's true.
We are proxies for our patients. It's the patients who take the risks, and we are kind of vectors for them. And certainly increasingly, or very much so in the UK in the last 10 years, there's been a big change to the amount of information we have to provide and are expected to provide, which is a challenge. I think in Australasia, I think you run more preoperative clinics and patients are seen well before the day of surgery to a greater extent than we. I think you've been better at it for many years, but we often see patients only on the day. And the challenge of getting information, risk information to the patient so that you can make a balanced decision, what we call those brand discussions, benefits, risks, alternatives, and the act of doing nothing to the patient. So I think, have we got a different relationship with risk? Ultimately, we're there to facilitate surgery, or in the case of intensive care, facilitate management of critically ill patients. So I think we always take on risk, but I think we judge, balance, mitigate risk and communicate it to patients. I think it's a really important job that we do. And I think anaesthetists can be proud of the role that they have in doing that. Are we better than other specialists? I mean, classically, you have the emergency laparotomy patient, the critically ill patient who's 80 with a mortality risk of 40%, and the surgical registrar has said, we're going to operate because we need to save your life. There's an alternative, and you're very much in a difficult situation in those circumstances. But I think anaesthetists are often good risk communicators. The old myth that anaesthetists do it because they don't have to speak to patients is long gone. I think most anaesthetists are efficient and good communicators.
Yeah, so we're trying to definitely break that myth. I think that most anaesthetists that I know enjoy talking to patients. Yeah. I wanted to come back to the NAP side of things, and maybe I've missed this, but have you been doing follow-up work in terms of the implementation of the learnings out of the NAP audits?
Yeah, it's the worst bit of what we've done, partly because in the planning of the NAPs, they're big projects. They take originally 3, now 4.5 to 5 years. It's a lot of effort to determine what the changes are. I'm going to be talking about it tomorrow to a certain extent in my first talk, but we make recommendations. So in NAP 3, we had learning points, and then the patient rep in NAP 4 said, you want to get rid of learning points and make recommendations, because learning points are for people to read and ignore, and recommendations are for organisations to implement. And I think we've always made too many recommendations, and we've always tried to thin it down, and each time the report is bigger, it's heavier, and there are just as many recommendations as there were last time. But we try and make them on the basis of them being national, institutional, or individual, so people can look at different levels. And there is quite good soft evidence of change. There's a lot of things where we can track changes in practice. So we've brought in various SOPs on the back of what we found in the NAPS airway checklists, a pathway for anaesthesia awareness, various things that we've introduced in that regard. There have been objective changes such as, so now every hospital in the UK has an airway lead, they should have an anaphylaxis lead, etc. as well. And then we track changes because we're doing activity surveys. We can see how practice has changed, a fall off in use of thiopentone in obstetrics, an increase in use of TIVA and process EEG monitoring that's used. So we can track the changes which reflect our recommendations. And for NAP4 and NAP6, there have been two specific projects looking at changes in practice, and both of them have shown quite significant what we call closure of the safety gap. So if you consider that a recommendation from one of the NAPs is addressing an unmet need, so if we can measure how much compliance there was with that need before implementation and afterwards, we can see how the gap has closed.
Great.
And in anaesthesia, after NAP4, 2 years on, we had a roughly 50% closure of the safety gap. And in ITU, we had 60% closure. They had a bigger gap, but a 60% closure. And we tracked about 80% of ITUs and 60% of anaesthetic departments making changes.
Wow, fantastic.
The big question, of course, is whether the changes change outcomes. So do they make things better for patients? So the first goal of the NAPs was to provide patient information. And that's what they do. They provide data for patients. And getting back to that risk mitigation, you can only act on data. And while the numbers are big, there's so much data in the NAPs that we've provided a huge amount of information on which anaesthetists can act to risk mitigate, to communicate risk, and to alter their practice. There is some soft evidence comparing NAP7 with NAP4 and NAP7 with NAP6 of an improvement in outcomes, a dramatic fall off in front of neck airways between NAP4 and NAP7, a dramatic improvement in mortality from anaphylaxis between NAP6 and NAP7. But you're comparing different populations, and as time marches on, the population changes and other NAPs are not the only thing that happen in it.
It's in an ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So in a way, it's for others to judge whether the NAPs have changed. Well, I can clearly say they've influenced practice. I was in South Africa a few weeks ago. There were some trainees I was speaking to, and they were saying how much they had to gen up on the NAPs because they had their exams coming up.
Yeah.
The fact that I get invited to places like Australia and other places where people want to listen about the NAPs, although they're UK-based projects, presumably they are having some soft influence if people remain interested in the projects.
They've been, I think, very groundbreaking for our practice in Australia. Just those things that you mentioned before about having an airway lead and an anaphylaxis lead in every department. That is something that we've taken on, and I see a lot of hospitals establishing those roles now. It is having a global influence, your work, which is very, very inspiring. But I'm curious to know, who inspires you in anaesthesia or outside of anaesthesia?
So there's quite a few people that were around in my training, people that no one will have known, but everybody has inspirational consultants when they're training. And mine were when I was a houseman, a gastroenterologist who then became an HIV expert called Brian Gazzard, and Joe Stoddart, who was one of the founders of intensive care as it is now in the UK. And when I was there in 1987, it was very different. And then in NAP4, I was very influenced by Adrian Pearce, who was a slightly iconoclastic anaesthetist from Guy's and Tommy's, but he was passionate about the airway, he was passionate about patient care and doing things right. And I've learnt a considerable amount from each of the clinical leads that I've worked with across the NAPs. They've sort of been my NAP husbands, I guess, because they've all been male, which probably isn't a good thing. I've learnt a huge amount from them. And then within my department, I happen to work in a department which has Jerry Nolan, who's certainly one of the leaders of resuscitation. And he's been an inspiration and a bit of a mentor to me. A bit more broadly, Archie Brain, who invented the laryngeal mask. There's a lot of trainees who don't know that Archie Brain invented the laryngeal mask. And then sort of outside, there's a mate of mine called Jeremy Farrer, who ran the WHO. He now is one of the deputy leads of WHO, and previously he led Wellcome Trust.
Okay.
And during the pandemic, he was an outspoken voice wanting to ensure that the UK government followed the science and made changes that would protect patients while accepting that the economy needed to be protected at the same time. And then I also like Atul Gawande for the quality of his writing. He irritates me only because he writes so beautifully. I think he is just a brilliant writer. One of my other mentors was a woman called Sheila Willets, who was a brilliant intensivist in Bristol as well. But I think what brings a lot of those people together is the ability to question the status quo, a willingness to challenge it when it needs to be, a willingness to change deep into your career. So not to just accept things as they are. And if you don't like as they are, or you think things need to be explored, to go out there and find some answers. And if necessary, change your view. I mean, science is about experimentation. Science is about experimentation, asking questions and being willing to change your mind if the answers show something different. I think we would all benefit from being willing to change our minds during our careers.
Wow, they are all very impressive attributes. It is wonderful to have you here in Canberra. I hope you enjoy some of Canberra as well as some of the Congress, and thank you very much for joining me in the booth today.
Susie, thanks very much. It's a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to my chat with Professor Cook and the buzz of the NSC around us. It really is a great time of year. Professor Cook does go into his work regarding the National Audit Projects in his keynote address at the NSC. I didn't want to hijack all that material in this podcast because you can go back and watch that talk at your convenience until the 21st of January 2026. If you registered for the NSC, you can go back and view all the talks via the app or via the website. If you didn't register, that's no problem. You can still register, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Now, I mentioned a little merchandise idea. Well, if you recall, at the start of our conversation, Tim mentions how he has scrubs, hats, and theatre shoes with his name and title on them. And he describes that so well. And that reminded me that when I go to work, I wear my own personalised scrubs. I like wearing them to work. I like not having to think about what to wear every morning before I go to work. It's just the same outfit on any clinical day. And the scrubs I bought are made of a fabric which is a bit thicker than your usual hospital scrubs, and they're also slightly stretchy. Not ride to work lycra stretchy, but certainly more comfy than some of my older scrubs, especially for the long commute to work. And yes, like Professor Cook's, they have my name and title embroidered on them. I found I get a lot of positive comments from patients about them. They like knowing who I am. If they've forgotten my name or they've forgotten my title, it's just there. It's embroidered right on my chest. And it's also been useful for surgeons to identify me, especially when I haven't worked with them before, or if I'm going to a new hospital, joining a new list or whatever. And I hope you're aware that there's evidence out there that having your name clearly visible is great for patient safety, especially when you're in a crisis or a resus situation. There's so much mental load going on at that time, and it's just good to be able to look up and see, yes, you're Susie, you're the anaesthetist. It's not unreasonable for, me to get asked to do a blood gas or put in a line or whatever. My scrubs have the added benefit that they have the ASA logo on them, which clearly identifies that I am an anaesthetist and not another staff member. So I've asked the ASA if we can offer those scrubs again, and the answer came back, yes, woohoo. How it's going to work is that the ASA has partnered with a company that sells scrubs, happens to be the same one that I bought mine from, and there are 2 different designs that they've made available to us. You can go in there, you can choose which design you like, you can choose whatever colour, your size, all of that, go through and purchase them, and when you do, you can opt to have your name embroidered on them. And if you do that, the ASA will pay for that, as well as the ASA logo being embroidered on them. They come together. So just to recap, you go to the website, you choose the scrubs you want to buy, you choose to get them embroidered, and then they'll be embroidered with the ASA logo and with your name and title. So the deal is the ASA will pay for the embroidery. The company will just send that invoice back to us. You don't have to worry about it. Not only that, you will also get a 10% discount off the scrubs that you purchase. So I hope you see that's a pretty sweet deal. There's also theatre caps that are available, and yes, I think at the time of recording, I think they can be embroidered with your name and the ASA logo as well. And once again, the ASA will pick up the tab for the embroidery. How good is that? I hope you like that deal. I'm pretty chuffed about it. I can't wait. I've been thinking that my scrubs have been going through the wash quite a bit, so it would be nice to get another set. At the time of me recording this, because I'm trying to get everything organised prior to Christmas, is that the team at ASA headquarters are putting the final details of this offer together. Hopefully it'll be ready to go in time for Christmas, so you can give yourself a little Christmas present and be ready to start the new year in some new, comfy, shiny scrubs. So do keep an eye out on your emails, and I'll also update the show notes to this episode with the link once the offer goes live. This offer is only available for ASA members. Remember, pre-vocational doctors and basic trainees, it's free to join the ASA, so you can join for free and then you can still get access to this offer. All right, I'm crossing fingers that it arrives before Christmas. If you liked this episode, then 3 other episodes that you might like are episode number 54, that's 54, that's my conversation with Professor Martin Colwick on WebAIRS. If you're not sure what WebAIRS is, it stands for Web-Based Anaesthesia Incident Reporting System. I think it's the largest one in the world that we have here now in Australia and New Zealand. And this really relates to what Professor Cook said about the fact that we as anaesthetists don't cause many complications, but when we do, we are particularly interested in them. And WebAIRS is a fantastic reporting system to enable that. So do check out that episode. The other one that is related to that is episode number 79, which is based on an analysis from WebAIRS on jaw dislocation in relation to anaesthesia. So that is an example. There are some other links in those podcasts for other WebAIRS related content. Another episode that you might like to listen to is our most recent episode, episode number 111, where I'm talking with Dr. Doug Hacking, who wrote an editorial for Anaesthesia and Intensive Care, and we are talking about the GLP-1 receptor agonists. And as you might be aware there is a lot of conversation there about the risk that those medications bring to our patients in terms of gastric aspiration. There is also another special offer in there for ASA members that might be of interest to you. In the meantime, I hope you are having a wonderful Christmas period, you're enjoying the summer, and as always, I hope you're staying safe, kind, and well out there. Merry Christmas for 2025, and see you in the new year.
This has been Australian Anaesthesia, produced by the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, with many thanks to host and editor Dr. Susie New, with music by Soda Lime Music, sound and engineering by Bearview, and graphics by the ASA Communications team. For more content, please visit www.asa.org.au.